So we're very lucky today to have Caroline Robertson here from very far away, Dartmouth College. Caroline did her bachelor's at Columbia and PhD at Cambridge and postdoc at MIT and Harvard. And she came to Dartmouth as an assistant professor in psychological and brain sciences last year. Caroline's work, she studies spatial navigation, autism, vision, all the cool things. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy. And thank you guys for having me to talk to you this morning on a Sunday morning. I'm planning to keep this talk kind of brief, leave some time for questions, and to show you a little bit of new technique-based things that we're doing in my lab right now using head-mounted virtual reality and eye tracking. So a lot of the talks at mine so far this year seem to be focusing on the broad question of what kinds of mental representations support our sense of place. And we've been hearing a lot about the neural machinery of spatial cognition, place cells and grid cells and head direction cells, and their contributions to building a cognitive map of our environment. And in this context, we've been focusing mostly on the memory structures of the brain, such as the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex. And in my talk now, we're going to be turning away a little bit from the memory structures and towards perceptual mechanisms. And this is because we as humans are very visual creatures, especially in the context of navigation. I can move a little closer too. So we tend to explore our environment using visual cues. We navigate to landmarks that we can see in our environment. We identify routes that we can take to traverse an environment through visual features. So perhaps unsurprisingly, we also have neural machinery dedicated to the perceptual representations of visual scenes. This trio of regions, which has classically been referred to as the scene perception network or scene selective cortex, is defined simply on the basis of being driven by the visual presentation of images like this, at this little corner in Boston, selectively more so than to images that are presented of other categories like pictures of faces or objects or bodies. But a big open question in this field right now is how these perceptual representations that drive scene selective cortex are transformed into the more abstract map-like knowledge that we use to navigate our environment. Our knowledge of where exactly that scene is in the world and what extends around it in visual space. In other words, when does a scene become represented as a place in the brain? And conversely, where in the visual hierarchy do you first see this higher level knowledge impinging upon our perceptual representations? Scene perception is really just a beautiful test case, I think, for us to understand how memory and our knowledge interacts with perception in the human brain. So today my plan is to talk to you about two things. So first, because I know that you guys are emphasizing especially techniques in this course, I thought I would throw in a little section at the beginning of this talk about a tool we've been using in this lab, which we think really unlocks the possibility of studying the interaction between memory and perception in the context of scene perception. And this is head-mounted virtual reality. And then I'm going to use some data from this part of the talk to tell you a bit about how we think that the active and immersive viewing experience that's afforded by head-mounted VR really impacts visual behavior in daily life. And then finally, I'm going to tell you about one study from my lab that tried to tackle this question of how a visual scene becomes a representation of a remembered place in the brain using a combination of VR and fMRI. But I'll start with this first topic, head-mounted virtual reality. So one of the reasons for this gap in our understanding between how scene representations are linked with the knowledge of our broader spatial environment is really that the vast majority of what we know about human scene perception in behavior or in imaging comes from studying behavioral or neural responses to views of scenes like this, which can fit into one single field of view, and they're displayed on a computer monitor. This image, of course, really lacks a lot of what we expect is important about how we interface with our visual environment. To start with, Our typical field of view is a full 120 visual degrees binocularly, and in fact, it extends even further than that, 360 degrees around us. And we explore this environment through head turns and body movements through which we are constantly exchanging our visual input of our current field of view with our memory of our surrounding environment. So an important next step in understanding scene perception in the brain is to start to include these types of dynamic and full field environments which people can actively explore. And I think head-mounted VR really offers a number of notable benefits in contrast to other techniques that we've used, especially in eye tracking in the field before. But in particular, if you were to compare it, say, to mobile eye tracking, which you can imagine also has this active sort of viewing experience, the most notable thing that it gives us back is the content control of what we present to a subject. That over the course of an experiment, we can bring you to 1,000 different places with visually diverse features and such, and study responses to those kinds of controlled stimuli. But we think that this last feature of the ability to really actively explore your environment really matters and really influences how people engage with a visual scene. So to convince you of this, I'm going to tell you briefly about a recent study that we've been running in the lab to test the impact of active viewing and active viewing conditions on visual behavior. And this study has been driven by my grad student, AJ Haskins, and Jeff Mensch in the lab. So in this study, it's a really simple design. The basic plot is that we show people a number of really diverse photospheres drawn from different places in the world, very different kinds of environments. Some are indoors, some are outdoors, some are social, some are not. And they're shown these scenes in a VR headset. And on each of the trials in this study, participants will look at these scenes in one of two different viewing conditions. In one condition, they're going to actually actively explore. They'll move their head around and see the scene through their own volitional control. And in another condition, they'll see the same scenes, but in this case, they will just be passively moving past them on the computer screen the way you would watch a movie, for example. And we've outfitted these headsets in the study with these little custom eye trackers that let us keep track of where a person is looking in these 360 environments. So this is just to give you a sense of what a person's gaze behavior might look like in an environment like this. Unfortunately, there's also sound I forgot about. And this is a dynamic scene. This is actually a movie rather than a still image in this particular demo. But you could see from that blue dot how a person was looking around the environment, fixating on faces, et cetera. And after an experiment like this is something like what our data looks like. We have sort of a continuous spatial temporal record of where a person was looking as they explored a scene. And as a quick plug for our lab, my lab tech, Tommy, has been working really hard on a toolbox that we think is going to be helpful for helping people to produce and analyze this kind of data that we're hoping to release by the end of the summer. So stay tuned if you're excited about eye tracking in VR. So the first thing I'm going to show you is just a very simple set of figures just about what happens in terms of how many fixations people make and how long those fixations are. So just low-level measures of gaze behavior in these scenes. And the basic plot is that between these two conditions where you've been actively viewing a 360 environment or just passively letting it move past you on a screen, as we would have been measuring in previous types of studies, people make many more fixations when they're in active control, and those fixations are a little bit shorter. But most notably, the size of shifts that they make in their 360 environment are much wider. So like for reference, in most traditional eye tracking studies based on a computer screen, we see saccade sizes that are on the order of about 10 visual degrees. And here people make gaze shifts in their environment that really go all the way out to the whole full 180-degree range. So this is just to say that in an active viewing condition, we find evidence that this type of viewing condition really is influencing basic low-level measures of gaze behavior. But more interestingly, we might like to do some more interesting comparisons of what changes when a person is given agency in their own visual environment. So we can do some model-based comparisons of how a person on average is looking at a scene like this. In this case, it's a picture of a cafe, and a guy is, maybe it's a butcher shop or something, maybe he's cutting some meat. What we've been interested in doing is comparing gaze behavior in those two conditions, active and passive, to models of visual environments, especially what is ranked as high in terms of low-level visual features that are salient in the environment, like areas of high contrast or orientation, and comparing that to models of what's meaningful in an environment, where these are built from MTurk raters who will just see little pieces of our scene and tell us where there are parts of the scene that they rank as being high in terms of meaning. So we end up getting heat in these types of models just based on where people are in the scene, where things that they're interacting with are, et cetera. But we can also turn to sort of a more naive approaches and compare these types of gaze behavior to different levels of processing in neural nets. I'm not going to tell you about that today for the sake of time, but just focus on that initial analysis of how, in the case of active versus passive viewing, people allocate their attention towards lower level features of a visual environment compared to parts of the environment that are ranked high in terms of meaning. And our hypothesis here is simply that when you are an agent in your own environment, you're more likely, we expect that you'll be more likely to allocate your attention towards pieces of the scene that are ranked high in terms of meaning, as compared to when you're passively viewing the scene. That's generally what we see. So between the two conditions, there's no difference in terms of how well the low-level visual salience model explains gaze behavior, but the meaning-based model seems to be a better match to individuals' gaze maps in the active condition as compared to the passive condition. So this is just a little bit of data to sort of a teaser to say that in the condition of this sort of head-mounted active immersive environment, it seems to be that having control over where you're looking in a 360 scene really matters for every aspect of your gaze behavior, from how you move your eyes in that environment to what you choose to attend to. And next, what I'm going to do is say, having this tool in hand, we'd like to use VR to help us to learn about how the brain links moment-to-moment fields of view, moment-to-moment representations of our visual environment with our broader knowledge of the surrounding spatial context. So I'm going to turn here in this section of the talk to a study that we've actually ran a few years ago. So this is historically inverted, using fMRI and immersive VR. So to harken back to my original question, we know that the scene network is driven by discrete views of scenes like this or like this. But we actually have much less understanding about how scene representations in the brain are influenced by your memory for the visual content, which is outside of discrete fields of view. So the basic question that we're going to ask today is, how do neural representations to images like this change once you know that these two images are part of a common panoramic environment? In other words, how does your knowledge of a 360 panoramic environment shape scene representations in the brain? And specifically, we're going to ask which neural regions seem to maintain that type of panoramic representation of our visual environment, and also whether any changes that we detect in terms of those neural representations impact subsequent visual behavior. And again, I'm going to focus entirely in this talk on these three particular regions of the brain, classically defined as the scene network. But if you'd like to hear a little bit more about what's happening outside of these regions, we can talk afterwards and talk a little bit more about whole brain and searchlight analyses. And our basic questions are going to be how representations in these parts of the brain shift as a function of knowledge acquired about a surrounding environment. So the stimuli for this study really needed to be kind of special. They needed to be a series of scene images, discrete fields of view, that came from a very homogeneous visual place. And also a place where our subjects had no prior knowledge of, had never been there before, had no spatial knowledge they could use to link these places together. So we turned to a remarkably homogeneous neighborhood in Boston known as Beacon Hill. And so some of you laughed, so I'll just give you a little bit more funny context about this. Everyone in our study was a student at MIT. And it seems like maybe you're aware that given this map of Boston, MIT is just right here. It's just across that one bridge. And of the 50 students in our study, none of them had ever walked across that bridge and been to this neighborhood in Beacon Hill, because students at MIT spend time at MIT, mostly in the basement. So they were perfect test subjects, and this was a perfect neighborhood for this particular study. Because as you can see, the visual images drawn from this neighborhood are all very, very similar. Every building here is built in the same sort of colonial style row house sort of thing, with a narrow red brick building and sidewalks and white curbs. And it would be really hard for you to guess, I imagine, looking at those scenes, which two of these are across the street from each other in the same environment. So what we did at each of these locations on this map is just create little photospheres for each of these 40 sites in Beacon Hill. And this allowed us to display different quarters of the scene to participants in a counterbalanced fashion. So when spread out, an image looks like this. It's just a 360 image that's warped and spread out here. And the basic question that we're going to ask in this study, both in behavior and in the brain, is going to be whether two shots of a location, which are in fact across the street from each other in space, are something that we can teach you belong together after exposing you to the context that's in between the two. So to test this, there are going to be a number of different kind of presentation conditions of these images. In one condition, you will actually get to see all of the linking visual content that is between one side of the street and another. In another condition, you will be shown again 2 quarters of the scene, but you won't be shown what connects those 2 quarters. So you'll again get to see those test images on the left and the right side of the street. I always call those like the test image pairs here and here. But in this case, you would be, in the no overlap condition, you'd be setting this quarter of the scene and this quarter of the scene, and never get to see the linking spatial content between them. And there's even a third condition as well, although I am collapsing across 2 different studies here for the sake of time, in which you are shown the 2 sides of the street, and you're shown a connection between them. That connection has some element of spatiotemporal continuity, but it's actually morphing through a totally different place. So in this case, it's a little image of a factory that's linking for you the side of the street on the left to the side of the street on the right. So that might afford you the possibility of associating those 2 sides of the street in memory, but via unusual spatial context. So here's an example of what these sort of study conditions look like. First of all, we basically ran this study twice in this paper, once using VR as a study tool and another time using movies, which were more adaptable for bringing back into the scanner. So here's an example of what people look at in the VR condition. So they're just looking around this same street corner I was just showing you examples of in Beacon Hill. They look to their right, they can look to their left, they have 20 seconds to study. There's an occluder behind them that blocks the rest of the scene. And then next you're going to see an example of that morph condition, where the person will be ported to a different location in Beacon Hill. And they'll get to look again to the right and to the left. This will become one of the test images there on the right. And they technically have the ability to link it potentially to the left, but via a strange other scene that they're ported into in the middle. So that's an example of that overlap condition and the morph condition. And then a more straightforward example might be to show you what the overlap compared to the non-overlap condition looks like in the movie form. So here you can see you're seeing 1 quarter of a street. You pan to the left and you pan to the right. Now you get to see that same street again, starting in the middle, looking to your right and looking back to your left. Now in the no overlap condition, we're actually still in the very same location. I know that, but the subject doesn't know that. They see a quarter of the scene looking to their left. And now they're going to see a quarter of the scene that's over to their right. But they will never get to see the linking spatial content between them. So by virtue of just experience of seeing those 2 quarters in the same trial over and over again, they may have some ability to learn that they belong together. but they haven't been given any type of linking spatial content to help them in that process. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to show you is just what happens in behavior later on if you're done with studying, and that study, both of those studies takes a good hour and a half of exposure to those spaces. Once you're done, I'm going to show you those two clips, single fields of view from the left or the right side of the street. And first, I'm just going to show you that in behavior, people are able to accurately tell us that the two images belong to the same place if and only if they have seen them in the overlapping condition. So I'm just plotting d prime on the y-axis here and comparing it to that overlap condition. And the other study where we compare overlap to the morph condition, again, we see significant sensitivity of knowing that those two images belong to the same location in space, but only if you've been given the opportunity to connect them. Okay, so really what we want to know is what this looks like in the brain. We've been able to teach people that two fields of view belong to the same location, and only half of the scenes have been taught in that way. The other have been learned in that way. The other half of the scenes, although they are truly from the same location, have not been associated in memory. And so what we're going to do in the scanner is just have people lie down, look at an image like this, and we're going to measure the pattern of response in those scene regions of the brain, just to a brief presentation of that image. It's about 500 milliseconds. The person's looking at a fixation cross. They're not asked to actively recall what's on the other side of the street of it in Beacon Hill. You're just asked a very passive question of, where did you see this, on your left or on your right when you were studying? And during our analysis, what we're looking for is some type of a change in the representational structure of this image as a function of your knowledge of what's around it. In particular, we're hoping that the pattern of response evoked by the image on the left side of the street will become more similar to the pattern evoked by the image on the right side of the street if you know that they belong to the same location in space. So what I'm going to show you here, does that make sense in terms of analysis? Okay, I feel like you had a number of MVPA studies already presented here, so I skipped over any methods there.
Is there an amount of time in between the presentation of the two images for the morph, or not the morph, but for the linking?
Yes, for both of those, both the non-overlap and the morph are matched in time for the.
And to be clear, none of this is in the virtual reality. This is those ones that you showed the square going back and forth. Did you see a difference between virtual reality versus the 2D image?
No, so in behavior, no. Any other questions? Okay, so these are the major results. So what we do next is just plot on the y-axis here what we're calling discrimination indices, which is just how much more similar is the pattern of response evoked by two images, which you've learned are across the street from each other in space, compared to two images which you have not. So the overlap versus no overlap condition. And what we can see clearly is that PPA cares really only about the visual properties of these scenes. These images, which are shown across the street from each other in Beacon Hill, are correlated with each other, whether or not they share panoramic context, and whether their shared panoramic context is known. But a very different story is seen in the RSC. Here, the representational similarity was stronger for pairs of scenes whose shared panoramic context has been learned by our subjects, as compared to unlearned or not learned at all, unknown. And this pattern of response is also seen in the OPA. So overall, these results suggest that specific regions of the scene network of the brain forge representational overlap through learning between discrete views of a panoramic environment. And I'll just say, this is plotting just sort of the different scores between those two effects, overlap versus non-overlap, in those three regions. And this is just sort of to highlight that you can see that the RSC and OPA seem to be very strongly influenced by panoramic memory. But in contrast, other regions of the visual system, such as the fusiform face area, which we wouldn't expect to be involved in this task, or even V1, do not show this effect. So it seems to be rather specific to particular nodes in the scene perception network.
There was no difference between these conditions in the PPA, but there were positive observations there of this information.
Oh, sorry, this is a different plot.
Yeah.
I should stay back here.
So does that mean that the houses across the streets from each other just look more similar?
So no, actually, I probably skipped over this a little bit too quickly. But across all of each say that there are 40 sites in Beacon Hill. In all cases, there will be, of course, two sides to any street. And across people, you will have either been a person who learned this particular site given the knowledge of the panoramic context, or on the other 20 scenes, you would have seen those 2 images but not been shown the panoramic context linking it. Does that make sense? So all 2 images are across the street from each other in Beacon Hill. Counterbalanced across participants is the knowledge. So actually, we don't scan the morph condition in this particular study. I'm going to show you a behavioral result in two more slides.
Just want to clarify, so for the non-overlap, when they were seen, right, there was this gap in between their perceptions beside the street.
Uh-huh.
Were they always the same street, the same location?
Yes. In all cases, it's always the same location. And just as you started out in this talk where I showed you all those images, and you couldn't tell that they were the same location, that's sort of a participant's naive state entering the study. And then for 20 of those locations, we'll put you in the overlap condition where you get to see that they link. And 20 of them, we put you in this no overlap condition where you don't get to see that they link. And across people, which images are which are counterbalanced. Does that?
So they didn't know that it was the same street, like they were in the same location?
Right. Yeah. Yes. So in the non-overlap condition, for all that they know, those could have been in different places. But we want to, on the basis of the visual analysis, control for any potential, let's say lighting influences of this photograph being taken on the same location at this time of day might make the 2 sides of the street more correlated on the basis of low-level visual features.
Sorry, one more. So does this suggest then that the retrosplenial cortex is kind of treating both images as a discrete location, like a different location, like forming a different representation? I guess I'm thinking of the egocentric cells described obviously in the literature, but then they might be setting up a new egocentric representation or whatever they're doing by just switching, by not having that continuity.
By not having that continuity. So you're thinking perhaps the difference here would have been a change, like if we had some type of baseline that actually this effect here of more similarity in the pattern response for the overlap condition wouldn't be driven by an increase in similarity in the overlap condition, but a decrease in the no overlap condition, because that part of the brain is now treating these 2 images as more discretely from another.
Right.
That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I think we've been interpreting it in the opposite way, of that this part of the brain is moving those representations to be more close to each other in space, representational space, as compared to the baseline of this no overlap condition. Not much yet, no. Okay, I'll keep going just to get us through the end of the slides and leave some more time for questions. So a final check that I'll show you just for fun is that when we do other types of discrimination-based analyses with these data, such as whether we can decode the specific identity of an image across its presentations, or whether the image has a sort of open versus closed spatial layout, which are spatial properties that are known to drive these regions of the brain. All 3 of these regions can do those types of discrimination, so showing that they are representing the image with fidelity and representing the spatial properties of those images just fine. It's this unique sort of function, it seems, in the OPA and RSC to be able to associate 2 images that are share panoramic context and memory. So having shown that the neural responses to scene views are influenced by your visual memory for the broader panoramic environment, I'm going to turn to one last question, which is a simple behavioral study in which we tried to ask whether this neural effect, this shift in neural representational space, might be impacting our perceptual representations. So what do I mean by this? Well, if our observation is correct, that this neural representation of panoramic space might involve some type of integrative encoding of various discrete scene views, we might hypothesize that scene views from within an ensemble might potentiate other views in the network that they are connected to when they are perceived. And in fact, this might be a very useful feature in real-world visual perception. Let's say if in anticipation of a head turn, in my visual environment, scene representations which are associated with my current field of view are already being pulled up, being primed. So we wanted to test this sort of priming hypothesis in the case of behavior. And to test this, we ran this final psychophysical study where participants are shown an image from a scene. It's a target image. And they're asked simply whether that image had been shown on the right or the left side of that scene when they had studied that space. And on some trials, that target image is primed with a very brief presentation of another image from within that same panorama. And we might expect that that prime would ping or activate the surrounding or connected fields of view within that network. Again, as a function of if you know that those fields of view belong together in space. And what we found is that in this morph condition, there is not in any way a sort of semblance of a priming effect at all. So you were just as fast and just as accurate to remember that that target image was on your right or the left side of your body, whether or not you were primed as compared to being shown a neutral prime, just a gray box, or an invalid prime, an image from a different panorama. But in the overlap condition, you are now not only showing a valid priming effect, but one that is much stronger than what was happening during this morph condition. So it seems that if you're primed with a discrete view from within an associated network of images, you are now faster and more accurate to make a judgment about the image as to whether it was shown on the left or the right side of your body. So all in all, we think from this study that our ongoing visual representations of single fields of view in our environment are to some degree imbued with our memory of our surrounding environment. We think that specific regions of the scene network might represent this intersection between perception and memory. And we think that there's some level of functional relevance to this, that perhaps individual perceptual stimuli, individual fields of view, are triggering your memory for the broader panoramic environment, far beyond a single field of view. So to wrap up, I hope that I've gotten you guys a little bit excited about the possibility of immersive virtual reality, especially for the processes of studying a naturalistic visual experience and how it interacts with memory. I also hope that I've convinced you that people actually make importantly different choices about how to engage with visual stimuli when they're shown in active and immersive settings. And finally, by studying the interaction between perceived and remembered elements of a spatial environment, I've shown you that specific regions of the visual brain seem to harbor sort of an intersection between memory and perception. And your memory for your surrounding environment impacts ongoing perception. So I'll end there. Thank my lab. A couple of them are in the audience this morning, especially Adam and Tommy sitting over there. Thanks. Back.
So we experience the world continuously, right? So in theory, like our memories are kind of made up of thousands of snapshots of overlapping scenes. So how kind of far in space do you think these effects extend? Like, is it just, two sort of adjacent scenes? Like, how far do you think you can kind of push this to? Could you get people to? Could you show them the whole Beacon Hill area and get them to sort of link all of these things?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question that ties into what we are currently working on in the lab. So you can imagine with virtual reality techniques like this, I can do much more than just put you in a 360 photosphere. I can put you on a Google map and sort of explore the expansion of these associations into broader and broader levels of space. So we're testing now the sort of nested representations of spatial context in that kind of way.
I guess you briefly mentioned that you're also doing video, not just photos for the active VR. And I was wondering whether there are any questions there with sampling and exploration, because in video, as in the real world,
Yeah, definitely. So it makes it a lot harder to show as a visual demo because at the end of a still image, I can just put a heat map on the screen. But in time, if things are changing, our analysis gets a lot more complicated. We have to track the relevant features as they're moving across space as well. but yeah, I think that we're definitely using video in some studies where we have an interest in how individual differences in the sort of temporal allocation of attention during interactions with other people in particular. Other questions?
So you've shown higher sensitivity for images that you know the context of, but another possibility is actually knowing the context of the statistical association, so you keep things worse of remembering the details of the scene, because the representations that prime is more holistic ones, still remembering the details. So I'm just curious if you look for evidence of that, or have you...
That's a really good question. I hadn't really thought much about sort of a trade-off in terms of the fidelity of local representations once you are associating and building up a bigger global representation. Definitely testable. Good question. Cool. All right, I'll let the next speaker pop up here.